Our final presentation today is by Dr. John Luzon. John will provide us some highlights, insights into understanding nitrogen loss and the use of ureas and nitrogen inhibitors. He is an associate professor at the University of Guelph School of Environmental Science. And welcome to Prince Edward Island, and hope everything goes well. Is he present?
He's getting mic'd up.
Oh, okay. Thanks. There.
Good to go.
Yeah, just getting mic'd up there. Perfect. Good afternoon, everybody. And I tend not to be a podium jockey. I just can't do it. And so I've got to walk around a little bit when I'm talking. If I was in an actual class, I'd be standing out back there as much as I would be out front to keep everybody engaged as much as possible and to keep me moving, to keep me awake. I recognize that I'm the last talk of the day, and a very odd thing happens when some people get a PhD. And it seems that there's an odd medical condition at which your ears close up and your mouth opens up. And
laser projector, please do not stand in the laser projector.
yeah, that's okay.
I'm not eye level with that, please.
Yep. And so I'm at the end of the day, so maybe I might run a little long. No, I won't do that. Anyway, looking around, it's kind of interesting in that when I give a talk in Ontario now, I can see most of the people I recognize. And a lot of them that I recognize is because probably about a third of them are my past students now, which is a good thing, indicating there's a turnover in agriculture and some of these young guys are getting into it. And if you're in a talk that I give in Ontario, you'd recognize that I spend most of my time talking about the process. And I talk about the process so that you guys can understand what's going on, because the same solution isn't necessarily going to work for every single farm. And so they'll give you a little bit more ammunition to think about, okay, well, what conditions do I have at my farm? And given that I now understand the process a little bit better, what might be the best solution for me? And that's what I call precision agriculture. It doesn't have to mean changing things on the go. It just means doing the right thing at the right farm. And if we're talking about managing nitrogen, then where I always start is with the nitrogen cycle. It's really our basis of understanding of what's going on in the soil plant system. Now today we can simplify it a little bit, because really all I'm going to be talking about are those losses that can happen that might reduce the amount that's available for a crop, and maybe put it somewhere where we don't want it to be, that could be an environmental issue. If we look at nitrogen, there are two main forms of plant available N, ammonium and nitrate. And in terms of the losses that we might see from those two, well, from ammonium, the possibility is volatilization. I'm going to talk about both of these a little bit later, but if you look at volatilization, simply ammonium can exist in two different species of the same chemical. Either ammonium, a solid that stays in the soil and is pretty stable, or ammonia, a gas that can go off into the atmosphere. And so when we're looking at volatilization, we're saying that some of the ammonium is converted to that gaseous form, off it goes, and there's an economic consequence related to that. If we don't lose that ammonia, then very quickly ammonium undergoes another process called nitrification. Biological process, so it has to be warm and moist for that to happen, and in fact there has to be good aeration for it to occur as well. But regardless, the implication is that we're taking it from ammonium, which is positively charged and pretty darn stable in the soil, it doesn't leach to any great extent, and converting it into nitrate, which is very easily lost from the soil system, either through leaching, which is relatively easy to understand. If we've got water going down and there's nitrate in it, we've got leaching occurring, or denitrification. Essentially what denitrification is, to put it simply, is that some forms of life are able to use nitrate nitrogen in the exact same way that we use oxygen as an electron acceptor. in doing so, they're converting it from the plant available form to a gaseous form, which can create both an economic loss because we're losing plant available N, and some of those species that we're losing are also environmentally significant as well. And so if we look at those then a little bit closer, really the goal in minimizing loss is to do a couple of things. If we can minimize loss, then we're keeping more in the root zone, which is plant available. Often you hear people talking about there being a trade-off between economic and environmental issues. In this case, it really isn't. If we can minimize loss, we can keep it where we want it to be and hopefully end up in our plant and improve yield. And so there's a win-win possibility there. And realize that there's any number of different solutions that we could use to try to minimize loss. And that's why I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about the process so that you guys can think about, okay, under the conditions that I have on my particular farm or this farm, as opposed to that one, what might be a better solution that at the end of the day will make me more money? And so when we're doing that, we need to think about all of those things at the same time. Now, what does reducing loss do for us? If you look at a typical response curve to applied fertilizer, in this case nitrogen, if indeed nitrogen is deficient in that soil, you would anticipate the response curve to look something like this. The first little bit of nitrogen you put on, yield goes up a lot because it's really deficient at that point, but eventually yield doesn't go up anymore. Why not? Because nitrogen is no longer controlling it. It's something else, whether it be water, incoming solar radiation, whatever the case may be. But if we reduce the amount of loss, or we're using inhibitors like a urease inhibitor or a nitrification inhibitor, there's nothing about that that causes yield to change. And so the upper limit of yield doesn't change one bit, but what does change and what should change is the shape of the curve. And so that optimal nitrogen rate that's going to make you the greatest amount of income may occur at a lower level. And as long as the cost of that new management or whatever it is that we're using to get that reduction in loss is less than the value of the grain increase, then we're making more money. And so realize that if we do not decrease N rate when we use these products, if indeed they're working, we really haven't got most of the potential benefit from them. Okay, so let's start thinking about what volatilization is and understanding the process itself. Now, I said that ammonium N could exist as two different species, either ammonium or ammonia. Which of the two exists is dependent on the pH of the system. So as pH increases, ammonium, you'll see it coming down because it's being converted to ammonia. And what's interesting about this pH curve is that probably not many of you, particularly here in PEI, have pHs as high as 8. And so if you look at that curve, then, geez, ammonia can exist in my soil. Therefore, maybe this isn't an issue. But realize that when we apply urea-based fertilizers, or in 28%, which contains a little bit of urea, there is a pH increase that occurs around the granule of urea. Not the bulk pH, just right there at the granule. Where that ammonium is released, pH goes up easily high enough for that to cause ammonia to form and loss to occur. And so if we look at that process of hydrolysis, there's urea, and I've included uric acid here. They don't call urine urine for no reason at all. It's called urine because it contains uric acid, which is essentially the same chemical as urea. So it undergoes the same processes as urea in the soil. It hydrolyzes and releases ammonium, ammonia. Now, when that occurs, however, there's also a subsequent pH increase right around that granule. And that's why ammonia can form. And if it does, then that ammonium is largely going to be in the ammonia form, and off it goes up into the atmosphere. Now, when we look at volatilization loss, the other thing that I'll show you in a couple of seconds is that it happens really fast. In the first few days after application is when you're going to see the greatest amount of volatilization loss, and after about 5 to 10 days, it's stopped. And so this is happening in the really short range, which means that management has to happen quickly as well. And so if we're adding a urease inhibitor, what it's trying to do is to slow down hydrolysis. By doing so, it means that the pH around that granule doesn't go up as fast. The soil can buffer against pH increase. If we have a slower hydrolysis, the pH doesn't go up as much, and potentially loss is reduced. But realize we'll only have loss if there's a driving force for loss. If there's no driver for loss, there is none. And so we need to understand a little bit about when and where we might see volatilization happening to begin with to understand whether or not we might need a urease inhibitor. So for instance, if we put manure or urea, there's a single granule sitting on the soil surface, and we didn't incorporate it into the soil, that thing is going to hydrolyze. There's no soil above it. And so the pH goes up, and off goes that ammonia fairly rapidly. Now, if we had conditions where it was really hot and sunny, why sunny? Because I'm more worried about what the soil temperature is, not the air temperature. Incoming solar radiation, that can warm the soil up more than the air temperature could. And so we need to look at both of them. If it's really hot and sunny, these reactions happen quicker. And that diffusion of ammonia to the air also happens quicker. And so you can get a ton of loss really quickly. Meaning that if we're applying it really early in the spring on a wheat crop, because it's really cool and kind of damp at that time of the year, loss is likely to be relatively minimal. But if we're applying it later in the summer and it's really hot and dry, boy, it can go off really quickly if the conditions are right. Similarly, one that people don't normally think about is wind. Why does wind affect it? Well, if you think about that loss of ammonia to the air, it's leaving the soil by diffusion. It's going because there's a higher concentration of ammonia in the soil than there is in the air above it. Diffusion gradient, off it goes. If there's no wind, a lot of that ammonia just sits there hanging right above the soil. What does that do? It takes away that diffusion gradient, and so the loss is slower. And in fact, a lot of the ammonia that might leave the soil might simply come back into the soil before it really goes anywhere that far. But if it's windier, that layer is gone. And so now, if we've got hot, sunny, and windy, loss can be exceedingly rapid. And you can lose a ton, and by a ton I mean all of it, within 3 or 4 days if the conditions are really ripe for volatilization. Okay, now what if we put it below the soil surface? And below the soil surface, I don't mean down 30 centimeters, I mean just far enough that we've got perfect coverage so that you can't see any urea granules if you look down. You can't see the manure if you look down. Well, in that area, hydrolysis will occur. pH will go up. But before that ammonia can reach the soil surface, it's going to hit low pH soil, converted back to ammonium. And so if you've got really good coverage, your loss can be essentially zero. If your loss is zero already, would you benefit from putting on a urease inhibitor? Well, no, you wouldn't. There's really no reason to use it in that condition. And that's why I really need to make sure everybody understands the process so they can understand where something may work and where it might not. But what if you didn't do a good job of coverage? Well, there's still a way that that ammonia can leave, isn't there? And so if you look down and your fertilizer trenches aren't completely covered, your manure isn't completely incorporated, and you can still see chunks at the surface, you can still see liquid at the surface, volatilization is still possible. And so under those conditions, maybe it is. And so if you knew that on your farm, even when you incorporated, because of the nature of the soil that you have, you weren't going to get complete coverage, well, maybe then there is a reason to use a urease inhibitor, whereas a farm down the road, they may have no trouble covering it up. No need over there. Okay, well, what if you left it on the surface, but right after you applied, there was a rain? Well, in this case, what's happening? Well, that ammonium that's being released, or that ammonia that's being released, is going to be pushed down in the soil by that rainwater, lower pH soil, converted back to ammonium, and loss might be relatively minimal. And so if you happen to have a rainfall after, then you're probably going to reduce your losses quite a bit, and that's going to be highly speculative at the time that you put the stuff on, but if it does occur, then loss can be mitigated in that way. Okay, so just to give you some idea of the impact that volatilization can have, this is some work that I did with liquid hog manure. I realized that liquid hog manure is pretty high in ammonium N, but it also has some organic N in it too. And so it's only the ammonium N fraction that's going to be affected by volatilization. In hog manure, it may be about 66% of the total N is in the ammonium fraction. In this case, we injected, and this injection system, I call it a shallow injection, but it was a system that got us perfect coverage. There was no manure evident at all, and it was covered perfectly. And when we did, we recovered almost 70% of the nitrogen in the manure in the crop that we grew. That's an incredible recovery rate. That's fertilizer rates. But we waited just 2 hours, just long enough for us to go across, apply it on the surface, and it became a little less tacky so we could drive across without mudding up the wheels. And we're already down about 11% in terms of our recovery. After about 5 days, 50% recovery as opposed to 70, 30% or 20% reduction. Or 30% reduction because we're down to 40%, sorry. And so you can see how quickly that loss can happen. In this case, it was really hot and sunny, and there was a bit of wind when we applied that material, and loss happened really quick. If you happen to be applying on a day that was really cool, no sunshine, then the urgency of management might be a little bit less. But in a hot, sunny case, we need to be out there right away. That type of data is presented in kind of an aggregate way in our production guide here in Ontario, in that it looks at the weather conditions when we apply the manure and the timing of when you incorporate it. And what I wanted to point out is that it's indicating that if it's hot and dry and we don't incorporate, we could lose 100% of that ammonium N. I'll go even further and say that after about 3 or 4 days, if the conditions were perfect, you could lose it all in that little bit of time. And so it indicates to you the urgency, how quickly we have to react if we've got conditions that are ripe for loss. And it also indicates the possibility of using a urease inhibitor in some cases that might minimize it if we knew that conditions were going to be ripe for loss. Now remember though that I always tell my students there's that saying that same crap, different pile, or something close to that. That is really not a good statement because manure is highly variable. From one species to the next, you have huge variations in the proportion of the manure N that is in the ammonium form, for instance. In this case, you'll see that liquid hog manure, 66% versus solid beef 12%, and realize that depending on how that individual grower manages those animals, that number can jump up and down within a species. And so really it isn't. It's highly heterogeneous. We need to make sure that we understand our manure. We need to know our crop in order to be able to manage it fairly well. But if we've lost 100% of the N, the ammonium N, from a liquid hog manure, then it means that only 34% of the total N is left to be used by our crop. And that's in the organic fraction. Only a small part of that will become available in the first year. In the case of beef manure, only 12% ammonium N, so we still have 88% left over. And so again, it indicates that we need to understand what we're managing to know how to manage it properly and know the urgency to manage it in terms of dealing with it. If those same numbers in that table applied to urea, then realize that all of the N in urea is in the ammonium form, and we'd have none left if we'd lost it all. And so again, volatilization, really fast. We can lose a ton really quick if the conditions are right. But also remember, if there's no driving force for loss, there will be no loss. So here's some data from a trial we did with winter wheat. And what you're looking at now is the response curve to regular urea applied. So no urease inhibitor yet, but we did apply one treatment with a urease inhibitor. Actually, there's two treatments. One was with Agritane, one was with Anvil. Doesn't really matter between the two because the impact was exactly the same. We got 101 bushels per acre when we used that product with only 71 pounds of N per acre. If we compare the yield that we got with that treatment with this response curve with regular N, it would indicate that that 71 pounds of urea with the urease inhibitor behaved like 90 pounds without it. Meaning that we could have got along with 19 pounds per acre less N. And you can start to do the math on how much money that would be in terms of savings. Realize that a lot of sites we work with, we got absolutely no response. Why? Because there was no driver for loss. And so there's no benefit from using that product. And so we really need to understand what's going on in an individual farm to understand whether or not this may be a benefit or not. Okay, so if we move on to looking at leaching and denitrification. I said that once in the soil, if ammonium was not lost to volatilization, it's pretty stable, and it is because it is positively charged. Clays in the soil, organic matter in soil are negatively charged. We call that the cation exchange capacity. And so it can hold on to those positive charges, kind of like a magnet, if you will, which really restricts the amount that would go to depth due to leaching. But very quickly in the soil, if it's warm, that ammonium will be nitrified. It's an oxidation, it's biologically controlled, so that's why it needs to be warm and moist to give the environment that these things need in order to live in. And it will be sequentially converted to nitrite and then nitrate. You'll notice that when it appeared, this step happened way faster than that first one. And that's a good thing, and it was done on purpose because nitrite is really toxic to plants. So we don't want it hanging around, and luckily enough, this second step typically happens at a faster rate so that we don't tend to have very much of that at any one time. We've got our two plant available species, either ammonium or nitrate. Now, the use of a nitrification inhibitor is designed to slow down that step. We don't want to slow this one down. Remember, we don't want that to exist in our soil. And so we want to slow down this step to keep as much of the plant available N as ammonium as long as possible. Realize that these nitrification inhibitors, they may last no more than 2, 3, sometimes 4 weeks, depending on the formulation. And so it's not a long-term effect, but maybe long enough to match up with when our crop needs that N a little bit better. Okay, so we're trying to keep it over here by slowing that step down. Now, to understand when that might be of value, we need to understand when the losses related to nitrate might occur. And one of those losses I said was leaching loss. And again, when we look at these two losses, realize that just because we have nitrate in the soil doesn't mean that it's going to be lost. The only way that it can be lost is if there's a driver to move it out of the soil. If there's no driver moving it, it's not going anywhere. In the case of nitrate leaching, we only need to know two factors. How much nitrate is there in the soil? Yes. But how much water is going to depth? Again, no water going to depth, no nitrate leaching. I'm going to deal with denitrification at the exact same time. If this was a talk more specifically about denitrification, I would break it out and we'd talk about a number of different factors. But I'll lump it together for now because part of the conditions that affect denitrification are similar to those that affect leaching loss. So if you look at the factors we need to know, well, yeah, there are these other ones in that this is a biological process. Remember that some life can use nitrate nitrogen the same way that we use oxygen. But nitrate isn't as good as oxygen as an electron acceptor. So if oxygen is present in the soil, those organisms will use oxygen. It's just a far better acceptor. It's going to be used. But if oxygen becomes limited, then they have the option of using nitrate. And so when we're looking at the drivers for denitrification, well, we need to have nitrate to have it being denitrified. We need a low oxygen environment as well. When's that going to happen? Well, it primarily happens when the soil is really wet. Similar to what we talked about in terms of leaching, we need excess water in order to create that driver. If there's no driver, nitrate isn't going anywhere. Okay, so to understand when that might happen, Peter talked about taking you back to your high school chemistry. I'm going to take you back to public school possibly and looking at how water moves in capillaries. The smaller the diameter of the capillary, the more it'll be drawn up in it. Well, why is it drawn up to begin with? Well, water is attracted to the surfaces of that capillary. As the diameter of the capillary gets smaller and smaller, yes, the surface area of that circle goes down, but the weight of water in between goes down a lot more. And so it has relatively more pull relative to the weight of water below it, and as such, it can go higher. Okay, well, what does that mean for a soil? Well, this is my crude representation of a soil in that we've got some solids and we've got some pore spaces around them. So a soil is essentially a vast array of different capillary sizes. When it wets up, whether it's wetting up from above or below, those small pores will hold that water up against gravity. And they'll continue to hold water against gravity until we reach what Peter called yesterday field capacity. Field capacity is just the maximum amount of water that that soil can hold against gravity before the water gets into those really big pores that have very little pull on the water and allow water to go to depth. Until that happens, leaching doesn't occur. So if our soil is below field capacity and there's no major rainfalls that take us above it, we shouldn't get lost there. In addition, it isn't until that time where the soil becomes significantly poorly oxygenated that we should get a lot of denitrification as well. And so you can see N going off into the atmosphere, that's related to denitrification. So again, the big point there, no driver for loss, no loss. Just because you have N in the soil doesn't mean that it's going. There has to be extra. Now, to understand when in a year we might have loss potential, I did a quick and dirty water budget for Charlottetown. Pulled out some 30-year average data, weather conditions, and did some calculations in order to figure a few things out. And this is what I came up with. And so if you look at on average, not in an individual year, I've never come across an average year yet. It's always all over the place. But anyway, if we're to look at on average, which is really all we can do if we're trying to long-term plan, then Charlottetown gets about the same amount of precipitation almost every month of the year. And that's similar to Ontario. And everybody in my class in Ontario always goes, oh, no, you're crazy. It's always raining in the spring and the fall. Well, yeah, it is, but you get these little drizzly rains. They go on for a couple of days and they don't really amount to much. Whereas in the summer, all of a sudden you get a thunderstorm and you get 3 inches all in one go. If we average it out, about the same amount. But what does change, because it's cold in Canada, that we don't get a lot of evapotranspiration potential in the winter. But in the summer, it can go up. So this represents the amount of water that the plants would use if water was never limiting. There are potential evapotranspiration demand. And what you'll notice is something interesting. In and about May, potential evapotranspiration is greater than rainfall. And that's really no problem in May because our soil, remember, holds water against gravity. It acts as a bank account of water. And in this case, at least for this sandy loam soil that I based this calculation on, there was enough soil water storage, at least on average, to meet the demand of the plants, even though potential evapotranspiration was greater than rainfall. But what I really want you to pay attention to, what's happening to the soil over this time period? Well, it's drying out, isn't it? And so on average, would there be a lot of excess water during that time period that would cause leaching and denitrification? Well, luckily, no. But like I said, there is no average year. And so we need to understand how often do we get conditions where there is enough water to cause downward movement. And that will give us an idea of what the value is of using a nitrification inhibitor depending on what time of year that we apply. And we'll look more at that in a minute. But if you look at what happens here in the fall, first part of the fall, remember our soil's pretty dry. It re-wets up until it reaches field capacity. Once it reaches field capacity, there's only two things that can happen. We've got surplus water that can either go as runoff on the surface or go to deep drainage. And so if we had a lot of nitrate N existing in our soil at this time period, we've got a huge amount of time for leaching to occur. And if it's warm enough in that time period, we could also have denitrification happening as well. So as long as we can minimize the amount of nitrate in the soil in these time periods, we can minimize those losses too. And in this time period, if there's no driver for loss, we won't lose it either. And so we need to assess in our conditions how often do we have the possibility for loss. But what if we had a different textured soil? So instead of having a sandy loam, we've got a loamy sand. Just switch the words around. Loamy sand is a lot sandier than a sandy loam. So a much coarser textured soil, less water holding capacity. And so in that case, now we don't have enough water to carry us through the summer. And we have a seasonal water deficit. And the seasonal water deficit that we get in Ontario is quite a bit greater than what it is here because we've got a little bit less rainfall and it's a little bit warmer, so we get more potential evapotranspiration. But even here, it's possible, even on average. Remember that some years you get less rainfall than you do others, and it's sunnier, and so you would tend to have a bigger deficit in those years. But what's important for us is what happens over here. Go back. In that because there's less soil water storage capacity, recharge happens faster as well. There's more surplus water and greater potential for downward movement. And we can see this on this data set. This is something that I did with Craig Jury from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. And we were looking at leaching potential on 3 different soils, from a really sandy soil, the fox up top, to a mid-textured Guelph loam, and down here in the bottom, a fine-textured soil, the clay loam. And to look at leaching potential, we use chloride. Why the heck would we use chloride and not nitrate to look at nitrate leaching? Well, remember that nitrogen cycle I showed you at the beginning? Every component of it is happening at the same time. And so tracking nitrate through the soil is a nightmare. Chloride, however, has a much more stable consistency. So we can add it at the surface, and because it moves down through the profile about the same rate as nitrate does, it will give us an idea of how quickly loss happens by simply measuring how much is left in the root zone. And so if you look at this situation, we applied it in the fall, and on that fox sandy loam, top one is with the chloride, bottom one none. By spring, gone. And so leaching alone has caused all of that chloride to leave the root zone. In the case of this Brookston soil, quite a bit left in the spring. Why? Well, because if you think about that Brookston clay soil, the rate of infiltration of water through it is so slow that water is more likely to run over the top than it is to move down through. And so you tend to get a little bit less leaching. But what about denitrification? That sandy soil will still stay pretty well aerated through that entire time period because it drains so easily. Not so much for the clay soil. It gets wet and stays wet, which means that denitrification risk on the clay is really high. Long story short is you really can't win for losing. If you don't lose it to leaching, you're probably going to lose it to denitrification. And so any nitrate that we have in the fall has a really high risk of loss. And so if we can minimize it, and we heard a few people talking about minimizing it. Tony mentioned the idea of that fall green up to take up some of that excess to try to prevent this from happening. Others were talking about cover crops. That's what they're trying to do with those cover crops too, partially, is to take up that excess N, prevent this from occurring. Okay, now if we look at managing nitrogen, we have a couple of options, and this is specifically for corn, in that if we look at the general pattern of nitrogen availability in the soil, and this includes all N, no fertilizer right now. And if there was plant uptake of N, it's added into this number too. So it's a measure of how much N was released from the soil. We tend to get this pattern in that it's low in the spring. Why? Because it was wet and we had losses throughout the fall and into the spring. But we didn't have a lot of new N being released from mineralization from organic matter because it was too cold and wet for that to occur. But then it starts to release here, and eventually we reach a maximum. If we compare that curve to plant uptake of an annual crop species, which looks something like this. Plant starts growing, little wee plant, doesn't take up N very quickly, but then eventually you got full leaf coverage over the surface of the soil, lots of photosynthetic capacity, it grows quick, it takes up N quick. When we apply N in the spring, pre-plant, theoretically what we're trying to do is to add just enough N to meet the requirement of the crop, and not a lot more, which could stay around and be lost in the fall. Now you'll notice though that there's a problem in that I said that the risk of loss was quite low here in the midsummer, but in the spring, depending on the year we have, that risk could occur up into this time period, and there's a lot of N sitting around and no crop uptake to use it. And so one of the potential ways that we can minimize that possibility of loss is instead of applying pre-plant, we could side dress it. We're still trying to just meet the need of the crop. We're trying to stay ahead of the crop requirements so we don't cause a deficiency. But if you look at the difference between the two, we've eliminated the risk from that N sitting around, not doing anything for the crop yet, but potentially being lost. Point is, if you're using a nitrification inhibitor and you're already managing N really well, then the potential benefit is likely relatively small. But if we're managing it in a way that may not be so good, or we've got a particularly wet year in the spring, then that's when the need might appear. Okay, so just looking at quickly here is again some wheat yield data. In this case, we use something called Super U. It doesn't really matter. It's just a combination of both urease inhibitor and nitrification inhibitor. And similar to the previous graph, there was an improvement in N availability, which resulted in 71 pounds of N looking more like 97. Now, this one was kind of interesting in that we also used just a urease inhibitor. Didn't do anything. Realized these products don't work in every field. This one didn't have a problem with ammonia volatilization, and so there was no improvement from it, only from the nitrification inhibitor. All right, looking at some manure data again, for those interested in that. Again, apparent nitrogen use efficiency, how much were we capturing of that manure in the crop? When we applied in early fall, pretty low. Why? Because the ammonium end could easily be nitrified because it's still warm enough, and there's lots of leaching and denitrification potential. Wait till late fall, we've got a better capture. Later in the fall, yes, we missed part of that leaching potential, but we're also applying it late enough in the fall, in this case, that the soil is cold enough that nitrification doesn't occur. Naturally, it's a biological process. The soil is cold enough that that biological process can't convert ammonium to nitrate, and as such, in that fall time period, leaching potential and denitrification potential is reduced. We might still get a little bit in the spring, but we avoid the fall. Far better in the spring because we've avoided a lot of that time period where there's a driving force for loss. In the case of typical response curve again, we looked at another trial where we're comparing using inhibitors on manure, and we looked at something similar to what I talked about before. We've got a manure yield without the inhibitor, and we've got a manure yield with the inhibitor. And so we're looking at how much improvement did we get from adding the inhibitor. And what was interesting is that when we applied that manure with the inhibitor early in the year, we really got no benefit. And we didn't because remember that those inhibitors are only effective for a short period of time. They ran out of gas before it got cold enough in the soil to prevent loss naturally. And so we still got as much loss as we ever would. When we applied it late in the fall, didn't do anything there either. Why? Because the soil was already cold enough that that conversion of ammonium to nitrate wasn't going to happen either way. So there's really no reason to put a nitrification inhibitor on something that wouldn't nitrify anyway. The only time that we had a hint of a benefit was mid-fall. Close enough to when the soil gets cold enough that it can hold it as ammonium long enough to that time period and reduce the potential for loss. So again, the benefit is really highly dependent on your management, and that's why you guys need to think about it for your own farms to understand when might there be a benefit and when, hey, I'm not going to waste my money because it's not likely to do anything for me. Okay, so just as a wrap up, and I'll include some of my funding sources. You heard earlier about the Grain Farmers of Ontario. They've been fantastic in terms of supporting my research over the years. And then we've got the Ontario government in this alliance program with the University of Guelph that has also been quite good. I hope that what you learned today, or at least picked up for me today, was that loss only occurs if there's a driving force. And so we need to understand for an individual site, what are the driving forces that go on there, and what might the best solution for holding it be? Remember, at the end of the day, we're trying to make money. We're not trying to have the biggest yield, we're trying to have the biggest wallet. So which one is going to have the most bang for my buck? How can I manage it in a way that makes sense for me? And understanding those losses, as I said, is going to improve our chance of hitting that one. And in doing so, hopefully, we can both reduce the environmental consequence that we heard about from Peter earlier that people are worried about, and have a good news story for the general public, which I think they would like to hear, and also make our wallets thicker at the exact same time. It's just a matter of us being smart enough to understand what's going on to manage it in a proper way. Any questions?
Great presentation. Quick question. How does what's the timing of release difference between a nitrification inhibitor and like a polymer coated urea? How much longer is a polymer? I know that that's dependent on whether it's soil conditions, but on average.
Okay, so the question was nitrification inhibitor versus polymer-coated urea. Polymer-coated urea acts as a delayed release as well, simply because water can't get to the granule to cause hydrolysis to occur, to release it to ammonium first, and then eventually to be nitrified. And the answer to that is that a nitrification inhibitor, maybe 2, 3, 4 weeks tops is the longest you could expect it. The polymer coated is really dependent on how they engineered that polymer coating. Some of them are designed fairly quick, some maybe not so quick. Now, what does it mean for you? You don't want it to be too slow, because then it doesn't meet the demand of your crop. So again, you need to think about, okay, well, what is the nature of my farm? How late in the spring do I have conditions normally that would be wet enough to cause a lot of loss? And as long as I can delay it into that time frame and still have enough N to meet the early growth demand of the crop, then that's what I'm looking for. And so in the case that we normally see, it is only 2, 3 weeks, and then we get to that point where evapotranspiration rates are just so fast that unless we get a really nasty rainstorm, we probably don't get a lot of loss. Any other?
You had two great wheat examples. One where 71 pounds of nitrogen acted like 90 from a volatilization loss, and one where 71 acted like 97 from denitrification loss. So we had the panel up here. They're all split applying their nitrogen. How do they predict on Prince Edward Island sandy soils when they need to buy that nitrification inhibitor or when they need to buy that urease inhibitor? Because I'm quite surprised in winter wheat that you got any benefit from the urease inhibitor, because I have a canopy there that stops the wind.
Yeah. Yeah, so what Peter's referring to is that underneath the crop itself, remember I said that wind was very important. And so wind hits that canopy, wind speed slows down. Still possibility for loss depending on how well closed it is. The other aspect about wheat that usually doesn't result in a lot of ammonia volatilization loss is that we're typically applying that N early in the spring when the soil is really cold and the reaction is slow, meaning the pH can't go up as fast and the soil buffers against it and loss is pretty low. That site, which I probably should have explained more, was one of these sites where we're planning on frost applying, and then it thawed and it was muddy as all get out, and we didn't want to destroy the plot by driving across, and so the N went on considerably later than what we would have really liked. It was probably around the 22nd, 23rd of April before we got to that site. And so by that time the soil was warmer, and so loss potential was there. And so in terms of that question about when we should be thinking about it, if we've got conditions where we're surface applying and there isn't a lot of cover so the wind can get down to the surface, that's a pretty hot time for volatilization loss to occur, and we might want to think about a urease inhibitor in those cases. In the case of the nitrification inhibitor, if we're early in the spring, then there might be a benefit from them, because remember, early in the spring, a lot of excess water, lots of potential for leaching and denitrification to occur before that crop really gets up and takes off in earnest to take up that N from the soil. And so it's really a site-specific basis. We need to think about what's happening, when am I applying it, what are the conditions when I apply it. Yeah, we'd like to think that the weatherman's good enough to predict what's going on in the future. I've never been particularly happy beyond about 1 or 2 days, but do the best we can to minimize risk without adding cost that doesn't need to be there.
Would you be confident in that situation to back off the amount of nitrogen you're putting on if you're using the inhibitor?
Okay, so the question was, would you be confident enough to back off on the N rate using the inhibitor? And the question of that, or the answer to that is, I'm currently trying to round up money to answer that exact question. In that if you talk to a fertilizer dealer, they do not want you to back off. They make money by selling you fertilizer. They want you to apply it. But on the other side of it is, they don't know the answer to that question. And so they don't want to come back and at the end of the year you say, hey, you didn't give me enough N, and I'm in trouble because of it. But if you look at our current recommendations, all of our current recommendations are made on normal urea N for the most part. If we have conditions in that area where they generated those recommendations that would cause loss to occur, then this isn't that different than going from a pre-plan application to a side dress application. In Ontario, we have different application rates for those two based entirely on the reduction in loss potential by waiting to side dress time. So this should be no different than that. One exception though, we also have the urease inhibitor. That isn't included in that change in loss potential really from side dress to pre-plan. And so there could potentially be an even greater impact than there would be from waiting.
Any other questions? Margaret?
Sure.
For potato management, I know it's cereal and oilseeds. Very often, sometime early to mid-June,
Yeah.
growers will be top dressing their urea on before they make their hill. And it can be very warm weather at that time. So if they're using an inhibitor but then incorporating it, is that the inhibitor going to slow the urea down and leave them freeze the urea down for the crop? Because, you know, it's our season.
Okay, so the question was, if you're growing potatoes and you're putting on N later before you've hilled it up, do you need the inhibitor, or does the inhibitor actually cause a problem in slowing down release of N long enough that it won't be crop available? In terms of the urease inhibitor, I wouldn't worry about it a bit. And the urease inhibitors are short-lived, week, somewhere in that range, and they've run out of gas. And so that's not going to slow down things appreciably in the field. Nitrification inhibitors, a little bit longer, but remember that you already have ammonium. It's only stopping the conversion of ammonium to nitrate for a couple of weeks. So there's still plant available N there. It's just not necessarily in the nitrate form. The question then becomes, do you need it at all? And that really depends on how well you're able to cover that fertilizer, on whether you need a urease inhibitor, and how wet it currently is and how wet you presume it's going to be in the next few days or a week or two, depending on how far out you're willing to believe the weatherman, on whether or not a nitrification inhibitor might be of benefit.
Yeah, very often the question is how far ahead of my hill or can I put fertilizer, can I put urea on?
How far ahead could you put it on? Yeah,
It's like, it depends on the temperature of the day.
it does, but I wouldn't let using these products change my timing of application to an earlier time just because I think it's going to hold it a little bit longer. Yeah, it might do that, but I wouldn't want to take one step back in terms of my management to use poor timing management in order to use these products.
Okay, thank you very much, John, for that presentation.